When a man withdraws his energy and emotional presence, something profound happens, not just in the relationship, but within the woman who once took his presence for granted. It's not the loud exit or the dramatic departure that shifts things. It's the quiet, the stillness, the absence of the care she became accustomed to, the attention she leaned on, the presence she assumed would always be there. Because in truth, most people don't recognize the value of something while it's readily available. They recognize it when the rhythm changes, when the warmth cools, when the silence arrives where laughter used to live. A man's emotional presence is powerful. It softens conflict, it anchors uncertainty, it brings a sense of safety and stability that many women don't fully acknowledge until it's gone. When he stops checking in the way he used to, when he stops initiating conversation, when he stops pouring into the connection, she may not notice the first day or even the first week. But slowly, the gap begins to speak, and the human mind is designed to pay attention to contrast. What was once constant becomes noticeable only through its absence. Women often underestimate that shift because they assume he will stay, he will understand, he will wait. They assume that because he has always been emotionally available, he always will be. But when a man truly begins to withdraw, not in anger, not as manipulation, but as a natural response to being undervalued, she feels that loss in a way she cannot easily dismiss. Female psychology is deeply sensitive to emotional energy. It responds to presence, to consistency, to affirmation. So when those elements fade, her internal equilibrium changes. Something that once felt secure now feels uncertain. Something that once felt guaranteed now feels fragile. This withdrawal often begins quietly. A man stops initiating conversations that lead nowhere. He stops giving explanations that fall on deaf ears. He stops offering emotional labor that is never reciprocated. He stops rescuing the dynamic by himself. And when he does, the emotional environment around her shifts. She begins to sense something is different. Less warmth, less engagement, less of him. And that awareness often sparks the first flicker of regret. Because regret rarely begins with a dramatic revelation. It begins with a whisper. A subtle feeling that something meaningful is slipping away. A memory of how he used to show up. A realization that his absence feels heavier than she expected. And beneath that, a deeper truth emerges. She depended on his energy far more than she admitted. Perhaps even to herself. There's something profoundly awakening for a woman when she recognizes that the emotional security she once overlooked was, in fact, one of the greatest gifts he offered. She begins to consider the ways she may have contributed to the distance. She begins to replay interactions. She begins to see the version of him she dismissed with new eyes. And slowly, her understanding expands. She realizes the moments she brushed off, the kindness she assumed would always be there, the loyalty she treated as ordinary were in fact extraordinary. A man who withdraws his energy isn't being unkind, he's being conscious. He's recognizing that emotional investment without emotional respect becomes self-betrayal. And when he chooses himself, when he steps back to preserve his peace, she is left with the echoes of everything he once offered. Those echoes become the mirror through which she finally sees his worth. And as that clarity grows, regret does too. Not because he punished her, but because he honored himself. Not because she lost him, but because she finally sees who he truly was and who she failed to appreciate. That regret becomes the catalyst for reflection. It becomes the moment she realizes the relationship didn't fall apart because he stopped caring. It fell apart because she assumed he always would. And a man cannot be taken for granted forever. His heart is resilient, but not limitless. His presence is strong, but not unbreakable. His energy is generous, but not infinite. So when he withdraws, not from pettiness, but from self-respect, she confronts the truth she once avoided. Losing a good man is far more painful than not having him at all. Because nothing teaches appreciation faster than the silence of a man who finally chose himself. When a man elevates himself instead of reacting, something shifts at the deepest psychological level. Not only within him, but within the woman who once overlooked his value. Growth has a way of revealing truths that arguments never could. Silence may create space, but transformation creates impact. And when a man chooses elevation over emotional chaos, the energy of the entire dynamic changes. Because female psychology is incredibly attuned to movement. Not just physical movement, but internal evolution, the kind that happens quietly, steadily, without the need for attention or applause. There is a profound distinction between a man who reacts and a man who rises. A reactive man tries to change the situation directly. He tries to argue, convince, plead, or negotiate himself back into a place where he feels seen. But a man who rises looks in the mirror instead. He asks himself not how to be chosen, but how to become someone he personally respects. And that difference in focus is powerful. When a man prioritizes growth over reaction, he steps out of the emotional battlefield and onto a higher ground that belongs solely to him. Women can feel that shift immediately, even if they can't articulate it. Female psychology recognizes elevation as a form of strength, stability, and self-awareness. It registers it as emotional leadership, and it creates a quiet, internal friction, the realization that he is becoming someone she no longer has easy access to. Someone she once dismissed, overlooked, or took for granted is suddenly outgrowing the version of himself she assumed would stay stagnant. And that triggers regret, not because he's trying to make her regret, but because genuine growth holds up a mirror to her lack of appreciation. The beauty of a man's evolution is that it doesn't require confrontation. It doesn't require announcements or explanations. Growth speaks its own language. It reshapes how he carries himself, how he talks, how he decides, how he sets boundaries, how he responds to life, how he values himself. And those changes create a new emotional experience for anyone watching, especially the person who once believed she could predict him. A man who evolves becomes unpredictable not in a chaotic way, but in an elevated way. He becomes someone she can no longer take lightly. And here's something many men underestimate: when a man elevates, he reintroduces himself to her without ever needing to speak. His progress becomes a new version of the story she thought she knew. His discipline challenges her assumptions. His confidence shakes her certainty. His peace interrupts her earlier judgments. And suddenly, she finds herself looking back, questioning how she missed the signs of his potential. Female psychology is wired to respond to strength, not brute strength, but inner strength. The kind that reveals itself not through dominance, but through self-governance. A man who rises shows that he is not dependent on external validation to define his worth. He becomes self-directed, self-assured, self-grounded. And that kind of man is not easy to forget. He's not easy to replace. He's not easy to ignore. And as he grows, something else begins to happen. Admiration from others becomes more visible. Not because he's performing for an audience, but because growth naturally attracts attention. People notice the changes, they comment, they respond, they appreciate. And when a woman sees others valuing what she overlooked, her regret deepens. Not from jealousy alone, but from the realization that she didn't recognize what she had until he became undeniable. She begins to revisit the moments where she dismissed him. She reflects on the support he offered, the loyalty he gave, the love he expressed. She replays the conversations where she minimized his feelings. She remembers the days he tried to pour into the relationship while she stood still. And in the presence of his evolution, those memories feel heavier, more revealing, more painful. But the most powerful aspect of his elevation is this: he no longer carries the emotional weight that once made him reactive. He no longer seeks closure in the same way. He no longer tries to prove himself. His growth becomes his closure. His progress becomes his peace. His new direction becomes his answer. And as he rises, she is left with the silent truth that transformation always reveals. Losing a man who evolves is far more devastating than losing a man who reacts. Because the moment a man chooses growth over reaction, he becomes the version of himself she never expected, and the one she now wishes she'd valued sooner. There comes a moment, often unexpected, when a woman begins to see a man not through her old assumptions, but through the eyes of the world around her. And that moment is powerful. It's humbling. It's sobering. Because people rarely realize what they've taken for granted until someone else begins to appreciate it openly, freely, without hesitation. A man's value becomes unmistakable the minute it is reflected back to him by others: friends, colleagues, new connections, strangers who can see what she overlooked. And that contrast is what awakens regret. Human psychology is deeply responsive to social mirrors. We don't evaluate ourselves or others solely based on private memories. We evaluate through comparison, through observation, through the reactions we see around us. And when a woman watches other people admire the qualities she ignored, something inside her shifts. She begins to wonder how she missed it, how she misjudged him, how she allowed a version of him, limited by her own perspective, to overshadow who he truly is. It might start quietly. Maybe she hears someone speak highly of his work ethic. Maybe she sees how another woman leans in during conversation, intrigued by the very man she once dismissed as predictable. Maybe she notices how confidently he carries himself now, how his growth draws attention without him even trying. And suddenly she's seeing him differently. Not because he became someone new, but because her viewpoint is being expanded by the admiration of others. This shift often reveals itself in small, almost invisible ways. She pauses longer when looking at his photos. She rereads conversations she once skimmed through. She watches him from a distance, socially, emotionally, mentally, and she sees him thriving, appreciated, respected. And with that recognition comes the quiet ache of regret. I didn't value him when I had the chance. It's important to understand that regret doesn't arise merely from losing a man. It arises from realizing that he wasn't who she assumed he was. Female psychology responds strongly to re-evaluation. When old beliefs collide with new evidence, the mind scrambles to reconcile the difference. And nothing creates that internal conflict more intensely than seeing other people celebrate a man's strengths, discipline, emotional maturity, kindness, or ambition. She begins to compare the way others treat him to the way she treated him. She remembers the times he tried to love her in ways she wasn't ready to receive. She recalls the moments he offered stability, generosity, patience, and she brushed them off as ordinary. But now, with space and perspective, she sees those qualities for what they truly were: exceptional, rare, valuable. And the more others recognize him, the more she regrets not recognizing him first. Because admiration from others does two things simultaneously: it elevates his value, and it exposes her oversight. This dynamic becomes even more intense when another woman enters the picture. Someone who sees his maturity as attractive, his ambition as inspiring, his kindness as grounding. Someone who values the very qualities she once minimized, and that's when regret turns into a deeper reflection. Not out of jealousy alone, but out of the awareness that she misread a good thing, that she misjudged a good man, that she let her comfort, her assumptions, or her emotional complacency blind her to the relationship that could have been. And here's the most profound part of this shift. It's not the external admiration alone that creates the regret. It's the internal realization triggered by the external world. It's the moment she acknowledges that she didn't just lose him, she lost who he was becoming. She lost the future version of him she never allowed herself to imagine. The man who is now unfolding in front of others, the man she once had front row access to, is a man she may no longer reach. And that realization carries weight, because regret is not just about missing a person, it's about recognizing your own misalignment. It's about seeing that your judgment was clouded. It's about understanding that you undervalued something meaningful. And when a woman confronts that truth, it reshapes her memory. It reshapes her story. It reshapes her accountability. So when other people admire what she once overlooked, his resilience, his character, his evolution, she begins to understand the magnitude of what she took for granted. It becomes undeniable. It becomes personal. It becomes the lesson she never expected to face. Because nothing awakens regret more deeply than watching someone else cherish the man you failed to appreciate. There comes a time, often much later than anyone expects, when silence speaks louder than explanation, when distance becomes more instructive than dialogue, when a man steps back, not out of anger, not out of spite, but out of self-respect, and that shift creates a ripple effect far more powerful than anything he could have said directly. This is the moment when a woman begins to feel the weight of absence, not the absence of communication, but the absence of access, the absence of emotional permission, the absence of the version of him she once believed would always be available. Human beings are wired to respond to contrast. We understand light through darkness, safety through threat, love through longing. And women, just like men, are deeply perceptive when it comes to emotional changes. They feel energy, they feel presence, they feel withdrawal. And when a man who once showed up consistently, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, no longer offers himself with the same openness, something inside her registers a shift. Not always consciously at first, but subtly, in the spaces where connection used to be effortless. She starts to notice his boundaries. She notices that he no longer rushes to explain himself, no longer sacrifices his time to soothe misunderstandings, no longer bends to accommodate emotional chaos. Instead, his movements become intentional, his words become measured, his availability becomes earned rather than assumed. And that change, simple, dignified, quiet, awakens a new internal dialogue within her. It's remarkable how often people realize value only after experiencing limitation. Limitations force clarity, they force recognition, they force honesty. And when a woman feels the impact of a man's emotional restraint, it dismantles the narrative she once held that he would always be waiting, always forgiving, always showing up. Suddenly, she is not the one choosing whether he fits into her world. She is the one realizing she may no longer fit into his. This is where female psychology becomes particularly introspective. Women tend to reflect deeply when they feel emotional distance from someone who was once stable and dependable. That stability becomes something to measure herself against. Her choices, her reactions, her maturity. She revisits conversations where she dismissed him. She remembers moments where he asked for respect, clarity, reciprocity, and she responded casually, assuming time was endless. She begins to see the relationship not through the lens of what she wanted in the moment, but through the lens of what she lost over time. And that realization has its own gravity, because when a man withdraws in self-respect, he doesn't shut the door with drama. He closes it with understanding. He closes it because he's done trying to convince someone of his worth. And that shift, his calm detachment, forces her to confront what she overlooked. It brings her face to face with the version of herself she was in the relationship. Not the idealized version, not the one she imagined, but the one reflected back through his distance. She starts to question why she didn't listen more closely, why she didn't engage more sincerely, why she allowed her own fears or immaturity to cloud her perception of his intentions. She realizes that his distance isn't punishment, it's evolution. It's a man choosing emotional adulthood over repeated lessons. And that understanding is where regret finds its way in. Regret isn't born from losing control. It's born from realizing that control was never the goal. Respect was, partnership was, stability was. And she may not have recognized the steadiness he offered until it was no longer hers to lean on. Healthy detachment is one of the most misunderstood forms of strength. It doesn't come from bitterness. It comes from clarity. It comes from having given enough chances, enough communication, enough grace. And when a man reaches that level of clarity, she sees the difference between silence used as avoidance and silence used as self-preservation. His distance becomes a mirror reflecting who he was willing to be for her, who she chose to be with him, and who she must now become on her own. And that is where transformation happens, not in holding on, but in recognizing why she couldn't. Because in the end, regret is rarely about losing a man. It's about losing the version of herself she wishes she had been when she still had the chance. And the moment she understands that, she realizes that his distance wasn't the end, it was the revelation.